Okay, so Natalie, if we could go on to the next slide, please. So thanks everyone for joining, and I'm delighted today to be joined by two of my colleagues. I've got David Savage, who's a senior manager from the Customs and International Trade Service team based in Ireland, and Greenell, who runs the Customs and Excise Duty team at BDO Italy. And it's fantastic to have both these colleagues on the call because they are actually living and breathing CBAM with their clients at the moment and helping clients implement their reporting and deal with lots of day-to-day and practical queries. So if we just quickly move on to the next slide, what I thought we'd do in the first instance is just set the scene with some polling questions. And we've got polling questions as we go through the seminar. So the first one is, has your business undertaken a review already to determine whether your goods are affected by CBAM either in the EU or will be affected in the UK? So there's three options there. There's the yes, we've done a review and it's completed. The second one is yes, we're doing a review and it's ongoing. Or the third is no, we haven't done a review, we haven't started to see whether we're affected by CBAM. So I'm going to open up that poll and I will let people provide answers on that. And then for about 30 seconds, we'll come back and we'll look at the poll results. So out of the people that responded to the first poll and hopefully picking that and ticking the options was relatively painless. So we've got a couple more as we go through. So we've got 21%, so a fifth almost of clients that are online and companies that are online have said that they have actually completed a review to see whether they're going to be affected by the EU or the UK. Got another 41% that have said yes, they've started it, but they're not quite finished yet. But there's near 40% there, so 39% have said that they haven't actually started a review to see whether they're affected by either the EU CBAM or they think they will be affected by the UK CBAM. So that's interesting, and maybe we'll get into that as we go through the slides. So if we move on to the next slide, what I'd like to do in the first instance is just kind of lay out what we're going to do today. So we're going to do a little bit of background and introduction on CBAM, initial thoughts on the story so far, what the business implications are, and David's going to cover that section, and Guido's going to cover the section on practical compliance and reporting, and then we'll firm up at the end on how we're helping clients at the moment. So if we go into the first section, it's just some initial background on CBAM to begin with. So let's go on to the first slide. So the EU introduced CBAM on the 1st of October 2023, and this was introduced to stop carbon leakage. So what is carbon leakage? Well, this is where you've got a business that imports goods into the EU and that they don't want to relocate their manufacturing or to pick suppliers from overseas countries that manufacture their goods where the environmental legislation is perhaps less stringent in relation to CO2 and greenhouse emissions than it would be in the EU. So basically, it's outsourcing your production or picking countries to buy from where the goods might be very cheap, but actually the carbon footprint for the production of those goods is relatively poor compared to EU manufacturing. So CBAM is a charge for carbon, CO2 and greenhouse gases emissions based upon the cost of production of the goods. Now, in theory, if the carbon price on imported goods equals the domestically produced carbon price for those goods, then leakage is removed. So by that, I mean, if you take the UK for an example, and say that there is a carbon charge that is applied to production of goods in the UK, and then we send those goods into the EU, if those carbon charges and pricing are the same, then it should be a net effect, because as part of the EU CBAM regime, there is a double taxation relief. So if you have paid an element of a carbon charge on production in the country of production, that will be credited against the EU CBAM charge, and only the differential will then be taxed. So currently, EU CBAM directly affects EU importers. But what we've also seen from my perspective in the UK is an awful lot of UK suppliers providing products to EU customers. And the suppliers are now starting to get questions from the EU importers as to, we need actual carbon data from you. Can you help us produce this to put into the CBAM reporting we have to make as the EU importers? So that's where the work is coming from the UK perspective. Now, the UK has said that they're going to introduce their own CBAM from the 1st of January 2027. And next year, we think there will be continuing consultations to design what that regime will look like. And it's worth bearing in mind, we could be looking at a change of government on the 4th of July in the UK. And Labour have already put out some thoughts in their manifesto that one of the things they would look at is to bring CBAM in earlier than the 1st of January 2027. So still very much up in the air and subject to change. Now, if we move on to the next slide, what I'd like to do on this is just to go through some of the key dates. So 1st of October 2023, the EU CBAM reporting started, and it's based on quarterly returns that have to be provided. And David is going to go through the difference between default and the actual value. So I'm going to let him do that. 1st of July, that's when our initial change is made. You move from default to actual emissions. 1st of January 2025, you have to do your CBAM reporting based upon the EU calculation methodology, and David's going to take you through that. 1st of January 2026 is when you have to start buying your certificates to actually import EU CBAM products. Before that point, it's pure reporting and no payments or certificates have to be purchased. And then from the 1st of January 2027, at the moment, that is when the UK CBAM will take effect. In the UK, so far, they've talked about annual returns rather than quarterly, payments at year end, and no anticipated trading of emission certificates, as will be capable in the EU. So if we move on to the next slide. So just thought in the first instance, it would be quite interesting to know, well, what goods are affected by CBAM? Which ones do I have to worry about of what I ship? Well, if we look on the left-hand side, this is the EU CBAM products that are actually caught. So we've got aluminium, hydrogen, fertilizer, electricity, cement, and iron and steel. And the reason that electricity is highlighted is that is subject to CBAM in the EU, but it will not be in the UK. And that's why some of the products are highlighted in red. Now, it's worth noting that it's different articles and types of materials made from these things. So if we take aluminium, for example, there's a whole host of different things that will be included that are made from aluminium, not just aluminium in its purest form as a rod or a bar. So there is really a bit of an exercise there to check whether your goods are actually caught or not. So what have we got from the UK perspective? This is what is proposed at the moment. So the same as in the EU, but we don't have electricity because we already have a carbon charge on electricity in the UK. So it's not included within CBAM. But the UK has also chosen to add in ceramics and glass. So they're two extra products. Now, as with CBAM, and David will get onto this, this is just what is initially put in from both sides. These products are subject to change and more could be added or some could be taken out in the future. But these are the products that are covered as it stands at the moment. So if we move on to the next slide. So one of the things that we found on EU CBAM is there have genuinely been some teething problems, as you can expect, where the new tax is brought in. So one of the things that has been quite difficult is the third country suppliers don't really understand the instructions that they're receiving from EU importers or clients on what emissions data is needed and how they calculate it. So there's a bit around there about an education and understanding what is actually required in terms of data from the production facilities in the overseas countries. I would say that the reporting platform is not particularly user-friendly. It's not fantastic. It's quite difficult to use. I know certainly from my perspective, it took me quite a while to get my head around it. The de minimis levels for individual shipments below which CBAM wouldn't apply, that has been set at 150 euros. And a lot of businesses are saying, look, that is far too low. It's disproportionately affecting businesses with smaller operations and smaller consignments. So they'd like to see that increased as a level. Been quite complex and disappointing outreach from the member states and the Commission. I think they're learning from that as they go. There's been an awful lot more webinars now, an awful lot of literature going out on what to do and how to do it. But initially, it was quite poor. Certainly, when we looked at the first quarter reporting for last year, there wasn't a lot of really clear-cut information out there. Most of the respondents to the survey are actually saying that what they really doubt their ability to provide real, actual carbon data from the 1st of July. It's very, very difficult to do so, especially in the amount of detail and complexity that the reporting template is asking for. And there's also something there about the impact on supply chains, which is the availability of niche products, which is, it might only be possible to source a product from a particular country because it is that specific and that niche. Therefore, if you don't have any option but to source it from that country, why should you pay a carbon charge on it if it's not produced in the EU, for example? So various different comments coming out of that report. And we've got the link to the report there if you'd like to read that in more detail. So if we move on to the next slide. So another polling question, just a bit of a litmus test on where are you in your CBAM reporting journey. So 4 different answers here. We're still trying to understand our reporting requirements. We've prepared our first 2 reports. So that's for Q4 year 23 and the first quarter for 2024. You've submitted your first report, which was for Q4 23, or you submitted your first and second report for Q4 23 and the first quarter 24. So you're completely up to date with your reporting requirements. So we'll just open that up now and then just wait 30 seconds and we'll have a look to see where everyone is. Okay, let's have a look. So there's still an awful lot of people, 84% are saying that they understand, they're still trying to understand their reporting requirements. Only 6% have submitted their first quarterly report and 7% have submitted the first and second quarterly reports. So I think what's interesting with that is as we move into actual data, and the first 2 reports were based on default values, they were really the easy reports to get in and submit. So it's interesting to see that people are still struggling with those, what are technically by the EU thought of as the easier reporting periods. And now we're moving into actuals. So if we just close that poll and let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so let's have a look at the thoughts so far. So what we've got here is just a brief screen of data, which is taken from the CBAM Central Transition Registry, produced by the EU Commission. So what we can see there is the main different countries where we can see CBAM products from the moment being imported into the EU. So right at the top, you've got Ukraine, Turkey, China, Canada, and then you can obviously see it move down. And it's split into aluminium, cement, fertilizers, and iron and steel, with iron and steel clearly being the main product that's imported into the EU. So I thought that was quite interesting because if some of those countries resonate with your supply chains and where you buy these products from, you're probably sat within those figures. So if we move on to the next slide. Okay, so this was something that David and I kind of wrangled with putting in there, but we thought it'd be quite useful to show that the first quarter's reporting numbers were very, very low. So only 15% of what the EU thinks should have been reported by importers has actually been reported to 15% of importers affected by CBAM actually lodge returns in that first quarter. We think that's probably gone up for the second quarter, but we haven't got the data for that yet. And this was reported in the FT. It's quite interesting if we look at the countries that which ones have gone first. So we've got Germany there, Poland, Italy is number 3. So Guido, you must be doing well with your compatriots in Italy to get all your CBAM returns lodged. We'll get onto that later. But it really does tail off, doesn't it? Once we go down from Spain and France and Czech Republic, it really does go down in terms of reporting requirements for imports from other countries. And there are some huge importing nations within those other countries that have really, really low reporting figures, such as Belgium, which is in the middle of the graph, which is quite interesting. So just a quick thought that if you haven't got all your reports in yet and you're still not sure that you're doing the right thing, you are clearly not alone in that. And there's an awful lot of importers that are struggling to get their returns in. So if we move on to the next slide. So how do you get started with CBAM? So everyone said that an awful lot of you at the moment are still trying to understand what your reporting requirements are. Well, the first thing for me is, do I import CBAM goods? And you need to check whether the commodity codes for the goods that you import are actually on the CBAM list. And David will go through that and show you where the list is held. Then if you are importing CBAM goods into the EU, then you have to become a declarant and submit reports. So the second question is then, right, I am importing goods into the EU. Am I myself EU established? So do I have premises? Do I have staff? Am I classed as an EU established business? If you are EU established, then yes, you need to submit your CBAM returns reports yourself into the member states in which you import. If you're not established and you use an indirect rep to make your imports into the EU, then you do your reporting through the indirect rep. And David's going to go on to what that means a little bit more in his section. Third question is, do I have all the required data? So initially, it's quite easy. You kind of just need to know, what am I importing? Is it affected by CBAM? What is the weight of my product? And then I can use the reference tables produced by the EU to actually work out what the embedded emissions data is. So it's literally a weight by product by default value for CO2, and that's how you work it out. Not too bad initially, but then as we've said, as we move now into July and we start to actually have to do actual value emissions data, it becomes far more complex. And then the fourth bit is just, how do I complete and submit my reports? And a little tongue-in-cheek there, but when I first looked at the CBAM reporting template, I did say to David and Guido, I think I need a degree in nuclear physics just to understand this reporting template. It was that complicated, but hopefully David and Guido can give a little bit more light and a little bit more understanding as to what is required for that. So if we move on to the next slide. So what I wanted to do here is just really bring it up to an elevated level in that what is the EU trying to accomplish with their CBAM calculations? So what is it trying to do? So if we look at this equation, which looks quite complicated, but it's easy when you talk through it, is they're looking for the specific CO2 or equivalent greenhouse gas emissions that are embedded per ton within the imported goods. So what are the CO2 equivalent gases in per ton of the goods imported? And they work that out by looking at the attributable emissions to the manufacturing process. So how much of those greenhouse gases are produced at the production facility? And that's from a direct and an indirect emissions basis. And David will go through what those are. And then it looks at, do we have any additional CO2 and equivalent greenhouse gas emissions embedded in the actual materials, the raw materials I use in my production process? So it's basically my greenhouse gas emissions for the production process itself, adding in the greenhouse gas already embedded in any of my raw materials. And then you just divide that by the quantity of goods that are produced at that facility. And that's literally the basic calculation for CBAM. And that's what we'll get into a little bit more on how that works. But just at a high level, that's what we're trying to accomplish with the reporting. So if we move on to the next slide. So Initial thoughts so far. One of the questions that we do get asked an awful lot, and I know David and Greedo, we put these questions together, like, what are we being asked the most? The first one was, if you're a supplier into the EU or you're an importer, then do I have an obligation to report? So there's no obligation for a supplier to undertake CBAM reporting. However, you've got to recognize that your EU customer and the person you're supplying your goods to that is importing in the EU is wholly going to be reliant on your data, especially on the actual data. So where is that going to come from? Well, you've got to be thinking about your production team. They should have details on the data and the carbon data that is embedded within the production of those goods. And your customs and logistics team that you have should be determining the customs tariff codes. So the CN tariff codes for those goods when they're exported, for example, from the UK. So what you'd be able to say to the importer is, that's the tariff code that we understand it is at export. It's probably going to align if it's UK EU to import as well. And then this is what we think the inherent carbon data is. And I know I've been working quite closely with Howard and a couple of people within our carbon accounting team to help individual facilities and production facilities understand just how to get and store accurate carbon data for their production methods. So if you are the actual importer into the EU of CBAM goods, then you have a legal obligation to do the reporting yourself or via an indirect rep if you're not established. So who within your business will be collecting this data for you? Well, I presume it would have to be the sourcing team. So they will liaise with the suppliers to get the data that is required to do your CBAM reporting. And again, the customs and logistics team, wherever this kind of activity sits, will be really important to help determine the HS tariff codes at import and to manage import shipments, and then to understand which imports create reporting obligations. So I think it's really important to start to identify any pain points now, either in your own carbon data accounting or those suppliers that cannot or will not provide the data to you, and start to think, well, what is the actual alternative? If you can't get carbon data from your existing suppliers, what do you do? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So if we move on to the next slide. So what I'm going to do now is pass on to David, and David's going to take you through some of the business implications and practical requirements of CBAM reporting. Over to you, David.
Oops. Thank you, Matt. I'm just going to start my video. Okay. Thank you very much, Matthew. Okay, next slide, please, Natalie. So just to ease ourselves into this section, I just found this information on the Eurofer website. Eurofer represents the body for the producers of iron and steel in the European Union. And as you can see here, back in 2021, we imported into the EU far more than we exported. So this tells us that the EU will need to import huge quantities of CBAM goods to meet its needs. So this tells us as well is that there is going to be a need to make CBAM reports going into the future. So next slide, please. Again, just to ease us into this section, I believe that CBAM applies to all third countries relative to the European Union. And I believe that that places the UK in a very strong position to capitalise. And why is this? Well, number one, the UK government has a strong commitment towards moving towards net zero emissions. And that means that, generally speaking, UK companies will be using cleaner technologies to produce their goods. Cleaner technologies will mean lower CBAM costs as your goods move into the European Union. Also, from a geographical and a political point of view, you could argue that the UK has really good access to the EU. Probably not as good as it has been in the past, but still not bad, and certainly better relative to lots of competitors around the world. The United Kingdom Emissions Trading Scheme is well established. And what does that mean? Well, the ETS basically puts a price on your carbon. And as Matt touched upon earlier on, this carbon charge that's paid by indigenous UK producers will be subtracted from your CBAM EU CBAM charges as your goods move into the EU. So we can kind of conclude that as a clean producer, there's definitely going to be opportunity for UK producers to gain market share within the EU. And again, Matthew touched on briefly there recently, I think last Tuesday in the Financial Times, there was an article saying that potential, I think we all know that there's a potential for there to be a change of government in the United Kingdom over the next couple of weeks. The Labour Party have said, or they've flown a kite politically, that they would like to align their emissions trading scheme and CBAM with the EU. If that was the case, that would greatly facilitate and ease the trading scenario for lots of UK producers of CBAM goods, because basically it would harmonize how goods would be treated from a CBAM point of view, and there would be basically a common market purely from the CBAM perspective. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide relates to one of the questions that we've received, and that is, how do I know if my goods are affected? Well, just like any EU regulation that touches upon trade and regulation, there's an annex to the regulation that lists every product that is affected by CBAM. So the regulation in question here is EU 2023/956. So if you just tap that into Google, you'll find it, and then go to Annex 1, and all the products listed by their CN codes will be listed in Annex 1 there, and that will tell you which goods are or are not within the scope of CBAM. Next slide, please. Moving on to reporting then. So as Matt covered, the reporting requirement really exists with the importer in the EU. So this is where your Incoterms become kind of important. So if you're importing into the EU in DAP terms, that generally means that the EU customer will be the importer, and the reporting requirement will rest with them. If you're supplying on a DDP term, that either means that you have an EU entity who can look after the CBAM requirements of the reporting on your behalf, or else you'll need to appoint an indirect representative. Now, the indirect representative, it's difficult to get somebody to act in this capacity, because they are jointly and severally liable for any inconsistencies or any issues that are identified at the port. However, if you don't have a presence or an establishment in Europe, this is your only option. You'll need to, and you need to deliver on a DTP basis. You will need to find an indirect representative in order to make that report, that CBAM report. Next slide, please. So here's just some milestones during the transition phase. As Matt said, there's 2 phases in CBAM. Right now, we're in the transition phase, and that's going from the 1st of October 2023 to the 31st of December 2025. And the definitive period will start on the 1st of January 2026. So within the transition period, we've subdivided this into 3 kind of sub periods, so to speak. So we are now currently in the first sub period. So this is sort of like the introduction. So during this time, the reporting requirements are pretty straightforward. We're able to use default values. They've been published by the Commission, and as Matt said, it's literally the commodity code. There's a default value associated with the commodity code, and you essentially multiply that by the volumes that you're importing, and that will give the embedded emissions that we report to the Commission. We'll shortly be entering into the second phase, which is the bedding in period, as we call it, and that will run from July 24 until December 2024. Sorry, there's a little typo in the slides there. And during this time, and we will need to provide the Commission with real values. So this is going to be challenging. Again, we'll go through this in more detail in a few seconds. Then from the 1st of January 2025 onwards, we will have to use defined methods as are laid down in legislation by the Commission. And then from the 1st of January onwards, we're into the definitive phase of CBAM, where CBAM charges become effective. Next slide, please. Again, just like any aspect of trade, it is a jargon-rich environment. So I've just selected a few terms here to try to explain to you to bring the topic to life, so to speak. So you might hear people in the context of CBAM mention indirect emissions. So basically, that is the emissions associated with the generation of electricity. So if you're using gas or coal to generate your electricity, it's the emissions associated with that. Direct emissions means emissions from the productions of process of goods. So it's the actual, it might be, say, the coke that you're using in your blast furnace to make iron. And then the embedded emission is just when you add your indirect and direct emissions together. So it's the total embedded amount of greenhouse gases in your final product. The default values are just values that are, I don't want to say arbitrary, but they are global averages for the amount of carbon and greenhouse gases that have been that are associated with the manufacture of certain products. And then complex goods. These are goods whose precursors and input materials have embedded CO2. The example I give here is clinker, which is a key component in the manufacture of cement. So clinker itself has to be reported. You need to report on the embedded emissions in clinker. And because clinker, the emissions in clinker also feeds into the emissions in cement, cement is considered to be a complex good. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm just going to go down briefly through what's involved in each of the phases as we have defined them in the transition phase. So in the first phase, the phase that we're in at the moment, you might have been, as UK exporters of CBAM goods, they may have been asked by their EU customers to provide some CO2e data. So what the E stands for there is CO2 equivalence data. So there are other greenhouse gases that are emitted, but they all can be multiplied by a factor to bring them back to a CO2 equivalence. Yeah, so during this time, as we've mentioned, we're able to use default values, and this is provided for in this Article 4, paragraph 3 of the implementing regulation. So we have two regulations. We have the regulation that gives rise, or that sets out the legal basis for CBAM, and then there's an implementing regulation. So basically how you manage the transition period. That's what that deals with. And as I've said, when you're reporting your carbon your embedded emissions during the transition phase, that's basically the default values again multiplied by the weights, and that is just an estimation of the CO2 emissions embedded in your products. Next slide, please. So during this period, the information that you need is your CN codes of the CBAM goods that are imported. It's the non-preferential origin of the goods that are being imported, and this is, I guess, just the Commission collecting some data. The quantity and the weight of the goods imported. Obviously, when you're multiplying that by a default value, that becomes quite important. Is the electricity used to make your good, is that taken from the national grid? If it is, again, default figures are applied. And then if your goods are, you need to provide the names and addresses from the end of this month onwards of the installations. So that's the actual facilities where the goods are being manufactured, and the operator. So that'd be the business owners, the big conglomerates of them who manufacture CBAM goods. And then I guess the Commission will want to know as well how many companies are using indirect representatives to make their returns. something that's worth mentioning here is for the Q4 23 report and the Q4 24 report, we are able to amend those reports so they can be sitting in your reporting in a kind of an unfinished state at the moment, but they will need to be finalized and reported by the end of July. So it's just an important one to remember. Next slide, please. So phase two is when the complexity really ramps up, and this is when we need to provide actual emissions. So we won't be able to use default figures anymore, and this makes it quite difficult. So the Commission have laid down in Article 4, Paragraph 2 of the implementing regulation what methods can be used. And I'm just going to quote from the regulation here. It's carbon pricing scheme where installation is located. It's a compulsory emission monitoring scheme where the installation is located. And it's the emission monitoring scheme at the installation, which can include verification by an accredited verifier. I've explained briefly there. You can read that in your own time. Next slide, please. So what does this mean in practice? This means that the Commission acknowledges that there are several different approaches used around the world to track industrial emissions. So that might be individual requirements from different administrations in different countries. It could be at regional or it could be at governmental level. The Commission considers these useful starting points, but it sets some limits as to what's acceptable for the purposes of CBAM. So again, if you're generating emissions data, it's likely or it's possible that that might be good enough to get you over the next period, but the Commission have set some limits as to what's acceptable. So these methods are identified in Article 4, Paragraph 2 of the implementing regulation. Again, that's an active link. So when you get these slides, you'll be able to click on that link. It'll bring you straight to that regulation. And these are technically similar to the EU method that's used in the European emissions trading scheme calculations. So also, I've provided here a link to a guidance document as set out by the Commission, where there's really useful information about for installations that are located outside of the EU as to how you generate this data or where you find it. Next slide, please. And then phase 3, that's when the Commission we run out of derogations and we have to apply the methods that have been laid down in legislation by the EU. So again, quoting directly from legislation, there's two options. The first option is determining emissions from source streams on the basis of activity data obtained by means of measurement systems and calculation factors from laboratory analysis or from standard values. Or the second method is determining emission from emission sources by means of continuous measurement of the concentration of the relevant greenhouse gases in the flue gas of the flue gas flow. So basically, you're able to monitor what's coming out of the chimneys on your facility. So again, as I said, we have this is jargon-rich area. So just to explain what activity data means, that's just the amount of fuels or materials consumed when you're, to generate the energy needed to operate your plant. The source stream is basically just the type of fuel that you're using, and the emission source is the identifiable part of the emission of the installation or the process within an installation from which the greenhouse gases are emitted. So next slide, please. Again, so what does this mean in practice? Well, as I said, we have two methods that we will have to use from the 1st of January onwards. And we're out of derogations. The EU will not accept anything other than the two methods that have been laid down in Article 4, Paragraph 1 of the implementing regulation. Now, the bad news is that this is hard stuff now at this stage. This is difficult and complex data to generate, and you will need to access somebody who knows what they're talking about. on a practical basis to generate this data. Again, I'm referencing that guidance document again. Section 6 provides practical guidance as to how to plan and undertake the collection of this data. So it's well worth going and having a read through that if you're in this position. And it covers the term. So these are the two methods that the EU have laid down in their legislation. It's basically the calculation method or the measurement method. Next slide, please. So just briefly, this is Annex 4 to the implementing regulation, and this sets out what information, if you're based in a third country, what information do you need to supply to the reporting declarant in the EU? So it's set out in, I would argue, reasonably digestible format here. Now, this is supported also by the Commission, who have designed the reporting template. And maybe if I can just go on to the next slide, please. So this is a table of contents for the reporting template. This is essentially a huge Excel file. There is instructions as to how to use it. Now, the Commission have claimed that it's user-friendly. I would dispute those claims. It's quite dense, and again, I think you're going to need to engage with somebody who knows what they're talking about here, somebody who's initiated in sustainability and emissions, so an engineer or a sustainability expert. So next slide, please. There's 12 tabs on this reporting document. This is one of them, and yeah, it's as complicated as it looks, to be quite honest. And there's 11 more tabs just like this one. Next slide, please. So just to finish off, this slide deals with the non-compliance penalties. That this is not something that really is of that much interest to third country suppliers. Third country suppliers are beyond the reach, strictly speaking, of penalties being applied by the Commission or by the national competent authorities. But just for your information, the provision for the penalties for non-compliance in CBAM are laid down in Article 16 of the implementing regulation. And this states that the amount of the penalty shall be between 10 and 50 euros per tonne of unreported emissions. The penalties shall increase in accordance with the European Price Index of Consumer Prices. As Matthew said, just because the third country supplier is not directly implicated or is not cannot really be charged penalties for non-compliance, your European customer is completely reliant on the provision of this data. It is worth again mentioning that in recent days the Commission have provided a webinar where they have said that where companies are engaging on a good faith basis and are doing their best, it is unlikely that they will attract penalties. The penalties are more envisaged to target those companies who are not really engaging with the CBAM process. So I think that's probably not a bad way to finish up my section of this. So with that, I will hand back to Matthew, who will bring you through this polling question.
Well, it was on mute, apologies. So let's just have a quick look at this polling question. So are you ready to submit your reports for CBAM based on your actual carbon data? So that's the reporting from the 1st of July 2024, so literally next month. So a couple of answers there. No, we're still figuring it out. We have the data, but we're finding the reports complex to complete. Yes, we have the data and filling out the report, but it's a very manual process. Or yes, we have the data and we've implemented an automated process for our future report. So let's just give the attendees 30 seconds to answer that. Okay, Natalie, should we look at the results? Okay, so I think everyone is very much, near 90% still in the, we're figuring out how to collect and collate our carbon data to actually do the actual emissions reporting. So no one is there. I think it's 4% actually have the data, but it's a very manual process to submit the returns. Okay, thank you. So moving on to the next slide, what I'd now like to do is invite Guido to take you through some of the practical compliance and reporting aspects of CBAM. So over to you, Guido.
Thank you, Sventy. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy you joined this webinar, so we have the opportunity to share information about CBAM, but also reflect about change that it will be determine our economy. CBAM is strictly connected to custom measures. It is an environmental argument, so we have started to interest in it since the EU Commission started to talk about this measure. Let's start to recap how the mechanism works in the first transitional period. In this slide, you need to point your attention on the reporting declarant, so the important indirect representation or the indirect representative has already seen, who is the person that must lodge the quarterly report. This subject receive goods and lodge the customs declaration. Customs authority validate it and then send information to the CBAM transitional register that exchange data with the Commission and the national authorities. The importer must request and receive the embedded emission data from the installation and submit the quarterly report on emissions. Commission then checks the CBAM report and in the event of irregularities, inform the national authorities that will follow up the case. As you can see, imported goods can originate not necessarily from the supplier, but can also be originated from one or more operators that can produce in one installation or in more different installation. As my colleague have described, the embedded emission data, even for the same products, may be not the same as they come from different installations, and for that may have different production processes and production routes. This data must relate to the imported goods to have the total quantity of the imported goods and the real CO2 embedded emission. Next slide, please. In this slide are indicated the deadline for submission of the report. As already indicated in the transition period, this is the month following the reference quarter. Is to be considered the first to report can be amended until the end of July 2024. In these initial periods, a lot of reporting declarants have submitted incomplete reports, so it's important to consider which reports have to be amended and start to the related activity. It's not permitted amendment in case a dispute is pending. Consider also that with an authorization released by the company authorities, the amendment is permitted within 1 year of the end of this reference quarter in case of valid reason. We know that there are still many companies that have not yet presented the report, even they are subjected. We suggest not wait the request of the company authority, but provide for the required fulfillment. Next slide, please. The process is not simple and requires an adequate organization, but how to move? First, it's necessary to understand the mechanism of CBAM, which activities need, which organization, and what is the ultimate goal to achieve. Then it's necessary to identify which goods are involved by this mechanism, their customer classification, where data are stored in the company. It's also important to know the non-professional origin of the goods. It's relevant where goods are produced, not from where they arrive. Example, goods arrive from Switzerland, not necessarily are exempted by CBAM, because if they are made in different third country, they can be subject to the mechanism. It's also significant to identify suppliers involved in the mechanism, to whom send the request of the embedded emission. These subjects shall identify the producer of the goods and the installation in which they are made. For those that have not still made, it's necessary to register in transitional registry and modality change country by country. In Italy, for example, you must register through the customs authority. In other, it is necessary to move through the national authority. It is also important to identify the custom declaration that refer to CBAM imported goods. This may be very hard if companies have not access to a complete custom repository. BDO, for example, has set up a system that allows all custom declarations submitted in Italy to be downloaded regardless of custom broker who operate them. And this will be very usable. As of the July import, it's be necessary to identify the embedded emission for each custom declaration, as already said, which will be not an easy activity, as the embedded emission of the imported article are not detailed but grouped in that document. Other aspect to be considered is that the report shall include all import made, even in different countries with the same IORI number, so in the countries where the company is established. Next slide, please. CBAM is not yet well known among the importers. Many of them did not receive any communication from customs about their obligation, even though this communication was envisaged in the regulation. An important point to consider is the obligation of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, that require companies to take into account their image to the stakeholders regarding their sustainability policies. The mechanism is still not ready to work, and many delegated and implementing regulations need to be issued. To this intent, it's necessary to consider a new category of goods, and more downstream goods shall be identified and added to the list. It is not logical to submit raw goods or semi-finished goods to the mechanism when finished products can be imported without any restriction. The result would be the opposite of the intent for which the mechanism has been created, and all production will move outside the EU. Another point the Commission is going to regulate is the carbon price effectively paid in third countries. Mechanism is based on neutrality of the embedded emission paid, if the importer can demonstrate this. Commission envisaged to obtain information in this transitional period, even if the most of the importers have not provided this data. Default value for the definitive CBAM period is another topic. They will be very different from those of transitional period, and they will be very useful because frequently full detailed data from installation will not be available, and they shall be used to determine the amount of CO2 and the CBAM certificate to buy. Commission has already said they will be higher than the real emission. Accreditation of verifier and the verification principle is another aspect that requires attention already in the current period. As said, the responsibility for importer or declared data in the future is up to the CBAM authorized declarant that will buy CBAM certificates. So it's important to go here to have the possibility to check the information received by the operators and be confidently about them. Another analysis is related to the potential CBAM extension to transportation of CBAM goods. Not envisaged currently, the extension can determine a further system complexity and the change of source of goods. Next slide, please. Some aspects shall be considered for the definitive period. For the first time, all identified persons will be authorized to import goods subjected to CBAM. So particular attention shall be dedicated to the not established person in EU. This is currently related to reporting, but in the next 2026, it will involve the payment. Only authorized CBAM declarant must and can purchase CBAM certificates, having evidence that the number of CBAM certificates on the CBAM register account at the end of each quarter corresponded to at least 80% of the embedded emissions. This activity shall be organized in the transitional period to be ready in the first 2026 quarter. Another point to be considered is that there is maybe a difference in CO2 price between the moment in which the purchase order is issued and when goods arrive in EU. What will be the fair price, and which certificates can be purchased? Price may change, and also economic impact for those that buy goods after having sold them. Do the selling price consider the variation of the CO2 costs? Consequently, it's important to monitor the price of CBAM certificates, bearing in mind that is envisaged the phasing out of CO2-free allocation in the EU ETS, and this will determine the increasing of the CO2 price. Some further suggestions in the practice are the evaluation of goods currently imported for processing that then will be re-exported. CBAM permits to avoid payment if goods are declared for inward processing custom procedure. This could be more difficult, but can be worth it to reduce CBAM impact. Some attention also for European goods exported for processing in other countries that return in the EU. Why not consider adoption of an outward processing custom procedure? Remember to verify the custom classification is well made. If it's well made, we have seen several cases in which for imported goods there is not a database combined nomenclature of goods. Custom classification is frequently made by a custom broker, having only the invoice information that may not be sufficient. A wrong custom classification may entail not only a custom issue, but also a CBAM problem. Attention, finally, to the goods arrived from sample and testing that may not be taken into account, often managed by corporate functions other than purchasing. I hope I have provided you some important points of attention on CBAM. I concluded my speech. Thank you for your attention. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Guido. So let's just go on to the last slide that we've got to present. I'm conscious of time. These are just the 3 different areas where we're seeing a lot of the clients come to myself, David, Guido, and other colleagues within the EU to ask for help. So the first thing that we've kind of done to help clients is to determine whether you're at risk of missing your CBAM reporting. So we've got a tool within the UK that analyzes import and export data. One aspect of that tool is to analyze whether CBAM goods are being imported or exported, and to quickly check based on the commodity codes for your goods, have you got any goods that are affected? And basically, we've been spending some time out with businesses just going through the basics of the reporting requirements, what data is required, and how to collate it. We've also been offering training for businesses, but also to come out and work alongside your production staff, your accounting staff, your customs, your procurement, your supply teams, just to say, right, this is what you need, this is how you need to get it. And we've got on a journey ourselves because it is a complicated subject, and we've worked an awful lot with our internal carbon accountants to go out with them to businesses to show businesses the best way to pull this data and report it over. And it isn't an easy thing, as David had said, and still getting an awful lot of questions as we go through. One of the last things that we're doing is some businesses have actually said to us, well, can you actually do our reporting for us? So by that, we'll collect the raw data from the business, we'll put it into the quarterly reports, and we'll give those reports back to the business to go, right, sign this off and submit it. So just 3 different ways that we've actually done that. So very quickly to move on to Q&A, because I know we've spent the full hour, and hopefully this has been really helpful. There's 2 useful web pages that are on the slide before that we'll get. I have gone through questions that have arisen as we've gone through. One of the things that I was asked was, what do we think the main challenges with CBAM? I particularly think it's getting the actual emissions data. Working with your suppliers to get the correct data from them is the thing that will make it easy or difficult, especially if you struggle to get that data. Because I know, David, one of the questions that we got in was, what do you do as an importer affected by CBAM if you can't actually get the actual carbon data from your supplier? So I don't know, David, if you just wanted to answer that question, and then I've got one quick question to give to Guido.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, well, I guess if you can't, I'll start my video. There is the requirement to provide the data when the definitive period comes. So if you can't provide it, that means that a particularly penal default value will be applied, and it will become quite expensive to bring your goods into the EU. And I think the rationale is it will encourage EU consumers or EU customers to move to providers who can provide that data. So that's as much as I can say on that topic at the moment, Matthew.
No, I think it's a good answer, right? It's if you can't get the actual data, they will apply the highest rate that they think for that product from that region. And it is, as you've said, a punitive rate to be applied then to the imports going forward. That even, David, might encourage some importers to seek alternative suppliers in the worst cases, to go, well, I need to go to a supplier that can provide you with the actual data.
I think that's the rationale for that approach.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, Matthew. Yesterday I attended the meeting with the customs, with the Commission, and the Commission is well know that many of importers don't have information about the embedded CO2. They are deciding what to do on that, and I think that we communicate some further information about this in the future. In this moment, it's necessary to give the information about the embedded emission, but if you don't have, you can provide them. This is the consequential.
Yeah. And Guido, just the last question over to you. What practically are you doing for your clients in Italy? So what is the main type of service that you're providing to clients to help them with CBAM?
The main activity we are making here in Italy is to assist the company to verify which are the goods that are subject to the CBAM mechanism, which are the custom declarations that are involved in this measure, because a lot of companies don't have the full picture of their import, and then we assist the company in create the process that need to be make in order mostly for the final version of the CBAM, when it will be necessary to pay for import the CBAM goods. So we create the process, we assist them to define which are the processes involved and which are the activities they need to do.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, so David, Guido, thank you very much for joining the webinar with me. It's been greatly appreciated. I hope everyone in the audience has found this really interesting. As we've said right the way through, it is a complex, difficult subject. So please do reach out. That might be to myself, David, or Guido. It could be to your contact within BDO in your own countries or to national authorities. But I think the main thing to do is to really understand what the requirements are. And I think collecting the data and actually then getting that into reporting bits, your reporting is the biggest challenge. And that's the journey that we're going on with so many clients at the moment, which is, let's sit down with you, let's sit down with your suppliers, let's work out what you need, let's give you questionnaire templates to get the data you need, and then let's get that into your reporting. But it is an ongoing journey. And I think, as Guido's just said, there'll be an awful lot of developments and an awful lot of changes to come on the EU side. And of course, on the UK side, we've got to prepare for our own regime when that comes in, which might be an awful lot faster than 2027 if Labour get in on the 4th of July. So thanks everyone for attending. I'm going to draw it to a close there. I think we've answered most of the Q&As. If there's some that we haven't answered, send emails out to the attendees. Thank you all for attending. Cheers.